want actually, because it's just lunch after this. So let's just keep talking. Let's take a few minutes, and if there are any more questions for any of the speakers that we had in this session, any questions raised about regolith or observations or experiments? Here we go.
Hi, Ben Hockman, Stanford. I'm just really interested in the physical properties of regolith on especially small bodies. And I sort of, in my history, have approached this from two different angles because I currently work on concepts for landing and mobility on small bodies, so you need to interact at sort of like a bulk level with these materials. And then I've also spent a good deal of time at a chemical manufacturing company where they need to, in the particle science and bulk solids handling group. And there we care about flowability and other bulk properties. And one thing I learned a lot from that was the properties of the materials. Yeah, you can characterize some of it with the properties of the particles, size, shape, but the history of the handling also has a huge influence on how it behaves and how cohesive it is. So it seems like even if we can get good estimates from all these samples with the particle size, the composition, but do we have an idea of how we can really emulate the history of how these particles were deposited on the surface of small bodies? For example, doing tests in parabolic flights is all well and good, but especially cohesive powders that have like high van der Waals forces, during these 2G pull-ups and the high vibrations, you're going to get a lot of pre-compaction. And this might be something that's not really present on small bodies.
Yeah, so for some of the collisional experiments we do, we usually apply an overburden when the trays are packed. So you apply a slight overburden, so in the early collide flights with Josh Caldwell, he showed that if you apply an overburden during launch or during those 2G phases of the flight, it actually keeps the grains basically as you packed them. So we obviously have more compacted samples when we're doing those things than you do if you have like a nice fluffy regolith that we could fluff up. And that's definitely something we've considered. But if you apply that overburden, it keeps them in the compaction you set it at, and so then you can kind of characterize that at least. In our experiments on the ground, we do a lot of things where we try to vary the packing density as much as you can in 1G. And we've seen that has an effect on ejecta, for instance, ejecta production. In some of the videos Julie showed, I don't know if you want to talk about those, but you can see that like sometimes the samples are much fluffier when you first open the tray, and that has an effect on the ejector properties as well.
Right. And then one other thought that came to me is how might we be able to emulate the bulk physical properties without doing gravity offloading? And it's like if only you could come up with particles that are the same size, shape, distribution, just lighter, right? Just 1,000 times lighter, so it's effectively like microgravity. And then there was this presentation on aerogel and how you can grind it. So it's just an idea came into my head about how you might be able to mix aerogel with some of these simulants, not to necessarily represent the chemical or mineralogical composition of these simulants, but to, in a 1G environment, emulate how they might interact with wheels and other potential human factors.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to address that with your silica samples, Gary. Yeah. So some people do like air beds. You can do some where you have airflow from underneath that'll sort of fluff up the regolith, but that's if you're doing it in 1G, right? You can fluff it up and sort of counteract the G forces pulling down.
Yeah.
And so, like the problem you get if you are actually in the lab, even if you could simulate lighter particles, if you could simulate low G just with the particles, your impactor is going to stick in there and just stay there. So you won't have a rebound, you won't have a mass transfer. So it's also about what happens to the impactor afterwards.
Yeah, developing the hopping rover that I've been working on, we have some test beds that are able to offload the robot itself. But one of the big problems, which we're not able to really capture in a laboratory environment, is the regolith itself and how it interacts. So we might be able to couple experiments where we have offloading for a lander or a robot with this type of.
So we're currently trying to offload with the spring. So if you calculate your spring length and spring constant very precisely for it to be at very low velocity when it hits, you can simulate that. That's true, but yeah. But then, like the cohesion of the grains is completely erased by gravity. Yeah, cool. It's a complex problem.
Yeah, I just think it'd be interesting because they have environmental chambers where they throw a lot of JSC1 in there to do lunar testing on large scales with rovers. And I think at some point it might be useful to have a facility that has this kind of larger scale environment for microgravity. And obviously, you can't always go on the Vomit Comet to do these 20-second bursts of experiments for these long duration tests. So it might be useful to think of ways that we can infuse technologies to represent the physical properties in Earth gravity.
To change is Amanda still here? Oh, good. Okay. Okay. Stimulated some more thought about that. In your data, at noon, OH or water is lost. And then it comes back within a couple of hours. And you suggested, I think, at the end of your discussion that period where it was lost, it didn't go away, but it went deeper and then came back out. Before you answer that, let me ask whether if that's not the case, if it doesn't go and hide itself and then come back out, could it be that it is lost but is more quickly regained? In other words, if this is, say, OH made by solar wind hydrogen and silica oxygen on the surface, could that be the rate at which it is formed? In other words, only over a couple of hours.
Oh, so you're suggesting that it could be newly formed?
Yeah, well, it's a question.
Uh-huh.
Either it goes away and hides and then comes back, or if that's not the case, if the high noon, causes it to dissociate and escape, then to recover it, it has to have a way of recovering it over a couple of hours. So, can you distinguish between those two?
Yeah. So let's see. So if you were, first of all, we need a way to form it still, because if we don't think that the solar wind is forming it, then we need some other way, right? Meteors, comets, whatever. So there's that.
Okay, let's assume solar wind, because I think most people will not argue too strongly against that. It may not be correct, but it's a reasonable model.
It's a reasonable model, but we don't see it being formed immediately anyway. So I had it in my mind that the molecules, when it gets hot and the sun is directly overhead, so there's no shadows, and the shadows for lamp get very cold because they're exposed directly to space, bounce away to shadows that aren't too far away. Right. Yeah. And so maybe it isn't lost to the exosphere, but it just bounces to a colder place that's not that far away. And so I don't think it has to be down. I think it just needs to be a cold shadow somewhere else on the surface.
Nearby, you mean?
Nearby.
Okay.
Maybe it's down. I don't know if we'll know if it's nearby on the surface or down, but then the temperature regime needs to be right for it to kind of come back later.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question. I'm going to have to think about that more. If we're then sensing it later on in the afternoon, being produced and staying.
Yeah, because it comes back pretty much to the level you started with relatively quickly.
Yeah, so that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see how that holds up.
Other thoughts with some of the stimulating discussion we've had of regolith issues?
I have a comment about Ben's questions, and it's that soon we will have at least 2 spacecraft interact with the soil of 2 small bodies. And those could be used as, there will be some quantitative results there, and those can be used as boundary conditions for some of the models, or at least as an input. And in addition to that, there will be imagery of different terrains which may have a different behavior in terms of the regolith. Likely it will be. And we don't know exactly what to expect, but so that we will have both mechanical and imaging data on 2 small bodies from Hayabusa and OSIRIS-REx.
And those two bodies are carbonaceous chondrite-like, which we have very little high-resolution data for. Actually, relative to that, and Roberto, maybe you know the answer to this, with the data we do have from the remote measurements, which are whole body, is there any character of the regolith that distinguishes some of these more carbonaceous chondrite to some of the ones that we have more, that we're more familiar with, like some of the... is there, I think it was Dan showed some plot that had thermal inertia of various various asteroids, and there was one group that had very low thermal inertia, and then of course all the small ones had a higher. Is there any distinction for carbonaceous or let's say the C-type asteroids compared to the S-type, which is the one we've looked at more closely with spacecraft?
That's a good question. Right now, the main trends that I remember are with size, but within those trends is quite a bit of variability. If we were to look at which ones are primitive or low albedo and which ones are not, we might see different trends. But Diane, are you? No, I guess Diane's not here. But Diane was looking at a near-Earth asteroid, which is it seemed to be dark and cool. And so that may have something to do with modeling, but it could be that we're seeing different behavior in this object. I don't know how you make something dark and cool. But.
Any more discussion? Everybody hungry? All right, well, if there's no more discussion right now, let's wrap this up. The next session is at 1 o'clock in the main room. We have the plenaries in the main room.